Right, so in the first video we spoke about what a fact is, which is obviously a very important part of our lived experience. Another thing that's very important is morality. So when it comes to morality, there are lots of different types of frameworks to follow. There are lots of different philosophers and ideas. I'm not going to talk much about that. I'm just going to talk about the three main types, or what I think are the three main types. So first of all, we have rules and duties. So for lots of people, being a moral person is dependent upon following rules and duties. So for example, you have religious texts, the commandments that come from God, or the various religious teachings that we have. For other people, the rules come from logic, and the logic is kind of tied to the survival and reproduction of our species. We're going to talk about that a bit more later. Next, we have outcomes. So for outcomes, you have things like utilitarianism, which says actions are moral if they produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And lastly, we have virtue ethics, which is kind of focused on your character. So trying to be a virtuous person by pursuing virtues. So I think it was Aristotle who said virtues, the things that you want to pursue, are the mean between two extremes. So for example, courage is in between cowardice and recklessness. So that's something that we want to pursue. We want to try and be a virtuous person. We don't necessarily just look at the outcomes or just follow rules. We want to be an overall good character in each situation that we experience. This is all well and good, and it's some good stuff to think about, but the main thing is this. What's your source, bro? I know I spelled that wrong. I'm just trying to be funny. But what is the source of morality? Where does it come from? So for lots of people, morality is subjective. So for the cultural relativist, there is no objective standard. Each community or group of people determine what is morally right for them. This is quite a difficult thing to defend because you can't condemn anyone. So if you have a society which is doing things that you find abhorrent based on your logical framework, if you're a subjectivist, you cannot condemn them, which is quite a difficult position to be in. So next we have logic. Logic as the source of objective morality. For some scientists, logic or reasoning, which informs how to behave morally, is a consequence of biological evolution. So for us as an organism, reasoning and logic is something that we have developed because it helps us survive and reproduce. By that understanding, well, if logic is a consequence of our organism's evolution, there is no objective standard. So if we evolved and our reasoning therefore evolved, or a different organism developed a different way of reasoning, well then logic and morality are still subjective because they are a consequence of that organism's evolution. So some people combat that by saying, well, logic is universal. It comes from the universe. Now that explains our lived experience a little bit better, but there is quite a big problem with that, which is this. So if you think that the universe is random and it's the consequence of atoms just interacting with each other, and those interactions are the framework for logic and how the game of the universe is played, and it's just cold hard logic that determines these things, and the atoms produce organisms which utilize logic to inform their actions, right? Well, there are certain actions that you can't really condemn. So if logic is just for the survival and reproduction of our species, well, if you have a person who wants to pursue relations with a family member and they don't reproduce and it doesn't affect their chances of survival, and there is no external objective morality. Morality just comes from logic, which comes from the cold universe and the interaction of atoms. Well, you can't condemn that. And I feel like most people would agree that is an inherently bad thing to do. So why do we feel that way? Well, what I would suggest is there is a creator. So this creator would be external to the universe. It would be the objective source of logic and morality, which informs our decisions, which is why we all collectively have this thing called a conscience. So in practical terms, that's not so great. This explains things a bit better. This, for me, the point that I'm at in my life, this is the most logical explanation for my understanding of morality and logic. Why is that? Well, first of all, because of conscience. So I think every human being has a conscience. I think even if there are societies which agree upon doing morally apprehensible things, people have a conscience. And the source of that conscience is God, or the creator, and the morals and the logic that make up the universe and our experience. That makes sense to me because even if people do bad things and they have a logical way of explaining them, well, from my observation, that will not negate your conscience. You can do bad things, but you will normally see the consequences of that in people's personality, in the way they behave, in them being prone to aggression, or how people treat them, or how they treat themselves even. So just to reiterate, this stuff is called meta-ethics, right? It's just thinking about morality. For me, a creator seems to be the most logical solution to all these theories and problems that we have. In practical terms, I would say this is quite important. But just as a human being, if you don't care about moral frameworks and you're not particularly religious, and maybe you believe that conscience is subjective, let's just talk about some practical things. So first of all, when it comes to the right action, a lot of people don't necessarily consider the time frame, right? So something might seem good now, but this kind of relates to the outcomes. If you think about the expanse of time and the future and how those actions play out, well, that might inform whether your action is moral or not. Another thing to think about is the context of your actions. So it's very important to consider the context of the situation when trying to find the moral truths within it. For example, if someone attacks you, well, some people might suggest that you should just lie down and accept it. But for me and my lived experience, that doesn't really make sense, because if moral people refuse to fight against or condemn immorality, well, then immoral people become the most powerful, and immorality is what happens in the world. Okay, so for me, my logical conclusion is that there is a creator, which is the source of morality and logic. Now, which creator to follow? That's a whole different conversation, which we will do later. But what I would say is this. Being a moral person doesn't necessarily mean prescribing to one moral framework. There are rules and duties that are given to us through our logical thinking and through religious texts. And we should use that as a guideline to pursue being a virtuous person or having a good character. And we should use the outcomes of our actions as a reference for whether we are doing that well. And that would be my basis for morality or trying to be a moral person. Now, all this is well and good. But I would say this, the most important thing to consider is that for most people, you are not ever going to experience these moral dilemmas or these messed up situations which kind of highlight why these things don't work in every situation. For most people, the right thing is pretty obvious. And what I would say or suggest is that 95% of the time, when someone engages in an immoral action, they know it themselves by their own framework that that is immoral. So, what am I trying to say? Well, when it comes to morality, there are lots of complicated ways to look at it. There are lots of religious texts to confuse you. But at the end of the day, I think most people know what the right thing to do is. And that's my 2 pence. So, thanks for listening.